Hey everybody, this time we're going to be getting into the sort of immediate post-war world, what it looked like right after World War II. Last time we were talking World War II, talking through some of the sorts of causes of the war and what daily life was like and some of the sort of propaganda issues, how it evolved, things like that. So here we're going to kind of cut in right to when the war is ending. There's a lot more about that, obviously, in the book that goes into greater detail, or if you want to know more about the war, we have other classes on that and stuff. I'm going to sort of pick up right where the war is ending and how that sort of shapes the new global picture, right? So the Cold War is going to begin basically right when World War II ends, and it sets up a lot more sort of distinct world system where you're either good or bad, you're either free or unfree, you have East versus West, and that used to mean like Europe and the United States versus Asia or something, but now it's going to mean Western Europe and the United States versus Russia. So there's these new sort of patterns being set up. And what's kind of weird about this, of course, is the Soviet Union and the United States were allies during World War II, so immediately afterwards that's going to end, right? So we'll kind of see how that works. So we'll start by talking about the immediate post-war, the sort of quest for justice, how the war is going to wind down, how people get back to a regular life, or can they even do that? Then we'll look at the start of the Cold War, which is happening again just immediately after World War II. Then we'll look at the sort of shaping of a new world. There's going to be a new sort of global system that comes out of this that doesn't really look like what was happening before World War II, and that's going to set up decolonization and the rise of China later and all kinds of stuff, right? So we'll kind of get that started and see how that's working. So right after the war ends, we're talking like 1945, 1946. The world was a pretty tough place to be hanging out. In the United States, things are pretty good, but in most of Europe and Asia, it's just not really true. It takes time after, you know, 5 years, 6 years, 8 years, depending on where you are, of extreme sort of war and repression. How do you get back to a sort of normal life, or can you? So, in these immediate post-war years, okay, the guns stop, soldiers start going home, but your neighborhood, your city, your country might be more or less completely destroyed. So in Europe and Asia, they've been so ravished by the war that you can't just go back to something normal. You have large populations that are displaced. You have hundreds of thousands of homeless folks. You got cities knocked down. Your economy is pretty much done. So if you look at this picture, this could be in France or Poland or Germany or anywhere really in Europe. These neighborhoods were made of bricks. The bombs were dropped on them. These buildings blew up. And it's like people are literally picking up the pieces of what used to be their neighborhood and trying to put it back together. So if you live in this community, for example, if you're this little kid, it's like, where do you go to school? Where do you get new shoes? All those sorts of things. So the community has to be rebuilt from the ground up, and that's really, really difficult. Right? I mean, you might have bikes and all, but look at the street. Like you can't drive cars through there. Trucks can't come in to deliver, stuff from the farms, right? And scenes like this are just all over. This is a famous corner in France, in Paris. It's just completely bombed out. You have to clean off the roads. You have to rebuild all the bridges, right? All kinds of stuff that you don't necessarily think of. You think of the war being over and then, okay, great, now we can move on to something else. But for the people that were actually there, it's like you don't have a job to go to because the store you used to work in is gone, and so you don't have any cash, and so you don't have any groceries. But even if there were groceries, there's no store to put them in, right? It's like a whole sort of snowball process. And it wasn't just in Europe. This is what's left of a temple, for example, in Japan. So this was true all over large sections of Japan and China. right? You have demobilizing soldiers, you have surrendered soldiers that can maybe help out a little bit more, but it's mostly just civilians, just mostly just people trying to, find a little bit of cardboard or a blanket or some sheet metal or something to just start building a place to sleep. It's really sort of starting from the ground up again. At the same time, for a lot of people, the war's not really over. So the killing, the torture, it's going to keep going. Formally, the war is over, and civilians don't have to worry so much about soldiers from the other side, but they might have to worry about their own soldiers returning home. If you were a prisoner of war, or if you had collaborated with the wrong side, if you were an enemy that just happened to still be behind enemy lines when the war is over, what happens to you? And that question is really tricky. So here you have some women that are being sort of marched through the street in France. They've had their head shaved. These are ostensibly women who somehow cooperated with the Nazis, and hence they're being like publicly shamed or humiliated, beaten up, right? So here's the French resistance, right? Shaving this woman's head. Maybe she was had been living with a Nazi officer or something, right? Or maybe she had worked in a bar that served the Nazis or something like this. So seemingly kind of innocent behavior, people that were trying to keep food on the table, people that were trying to keep their job, sometimes get deemed, collaborators in the end. And what do you do with these people? It's tempting to be like, oh, cool, we'll just let them all go about their lives. But that's not really what happened, right? On the other hand, even with all of this sort of destruction and a sort of lack of the physical community, the economy grinding to a halt, there's still this sense that the future is bright. The war's been going on for years, the war is over, the good guys won, right? And now something better can happen. You can move forward with, uh, a positive sort of vibe, right? Victory over Japan, right? So the war is fully over by this point. So one of the first things people try to do to move forward and to rebuild is to seek justice for the people who died, for the soldiers who died, for the countries that were at war with each other or were invaded. But that's really tricky. When you're talking about a war, responsibility can be so diffused. Was it the commanders? Was it the individual soldiers? Was it the people that let it happen? Was it the people that voted for, that government or whatever? So there's all kinds of places you might put the blame. There's a sort of international effort to try and punish the people seen as most responsible for the war. So in 1945 and into 46, there's the Nuremberg trials, which are held in Germany to sort of prosecute the top Nazi leadership for the crimes that were committed during the war. And there's sort of a new thing that gets invented in this process: crimes against humanity. So the League of Nations had sort of been toying with this idea, but it had never really been fully spelled out. What is a crime against humanity? People hadn't really talked like this before, but now that you had this giant global war, you could make the argument that the actions of the Nazis or the Japanese had somehow hurt like all human beings on the planet. So people had tried for war crimes. 24 of the sort of top command structure members from the German military or from German politics are tried. Most of them are found guilty and sentenced to death, like this guy Eichmann right here. But this is just one sort of limited section, right? This is looking at the people at the very top, the policymakers, punishing them. A similar thing takes place in Tokyo, the Tokyo War Crimes Trial. Because it's happening a little bit later, the United States and the United Nations and sort of international judicial bodies now have a sense of what these things mean. What is genocide? What is a war crime? What is a crime against humanity? They've been slightly worked out. So in Japan, 28 people are tried, and the majority are given life sentences, right? Here's some more of the Nazis being tried. I love how these guys are wearing sunglasses like they're embarrassed now or something, you know? Yeah. So in Japan, it's a little bit different. Most of the people are not um, sentenced to death. They're more likely to be given jail sentences. This is Tojo, right? General Tojo, who was once the military commander, the main military commander for Japan. Interestingly, the Emperor of Japan was not put on trial, even though he had been a central part of the war. That was a strategic decision by the United States. The United States wanted to continue to use him for propaganda value rather than put him in prison. Russia holds their own trials as well. These were much more limited. This was a specific war crimes trial, Khabarovsk war crimes trial, and this was aimed at punishing Japanese officers that had been conducting biological experiments in Eastern Russia. So there's these big sort of international efforts to punish like top leadership, top scientists, top politicians, top military officers, but there's also tens of thousands of small local, state level, city level trials. And this is where most of the sort of punishment, executions, imprisonment comes. Every little town can have their own trial, their own way of sort of settling the war. But sometimes people might look at this and feel like maybe justice didn't work. So in one place where you might say, hey, that doesn't seem quite right, might be Operation Paperclip. So this was an American project. Basically, there were a lot of top Nazi scientists who had helped um, do everything from make the gas chambers to make, V2 rockets to do submarine design, who had been working on creating their own atomic bomb before that went bad, all kinds of stuff like this. And doctors who had been experimenting on people in the camps and stuff. That had accumulated a lot of scientific and technological knowledge. So if the US had allowed these people to be punished or imprisoned or executed, all of that would have been lost. So instead, the US secretly rounded up a bunch of these guys. Here's some of them pictured, and sort of transformed them. They gave them new identities, new paperwork, brought them to the United States, and settled them around the country so they could continue to conduct their research and work basically for the United States. So you might look at this and be like, so we took Nazis and like brought them to the US and gave them jobs and stuff, and it's like, yeah. So some people might see that and think, well, that's not really justice there. But it was a sort of strategic decision to not lose those advancements. So the quest for justice is really hard. Who do you punish? How much do you punish them? Today, even every once in a while, although it's pretty rare now, they'll find somebody who was like a guard, like just a police officer or something, who had worked for the Nazis that will get, shipped back to Germany or shipped to Israel for a trial. And so it sort of continues where you put the blame and how you try these people. Beyond the trials, there was another sort of general quest for justice, or to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. And we saw this after World War I with the creation of the League of Nations. So ultimately, the League of Nations failed and contributed, at least in part, to World War I, the settlement not sort of working so well, and the problems in the 20s and 30s, and then towards World War II. So the idea was to create another international body like the League of Nations, but give it more power, more authority, make it function better. The League of Nations had been ineffective for a number of reasons. It didn't include the US, right, which was becoming one of the most powerful countries in the world. It had no enforcement power. It was contradictory, right, all these sorts of things. So the UN is going to be in its place. It's based in New York, but it was originally based in San Francisco and moved to New York. And the idea was that it would be an international global body with politicians that come and solve problems rather than through war. And it had a special mandate to protect human rights. So again, this was a very new idea. In the same way that you could have crimes against humanity, now people were talking about rights of humanity. It also was designed to promote cultural exchange, the idea being if we all knew kind of more about each other and each other's cultures, we might be less likely to go to war or participate in those sort of hyper-racist um, sort of ideologies that led to some aspects of World War II. Originally, there were 51 nations in the UN. Now there's, I think, 193 or 194. So really large international body. Here's some of the founding members, right, in the charter. But because of the way World War II ended, the Allies gave themselves sort of special power within the United Nations. So the US, France, China, the Soviet Union, and the UK all have veto power within the United Nations. So even when they engage in legislation and try to pass reforms or statements or all these sorts of things, each of these countries could veto some aspect of it. Now, this is a sort of historical legacy. It today is sort of weird and useless because India, Brazil, there's other countries that are really big global players economically or in terms of population. It doesn't really make sense that maybe France should have a vote in the same way as all of India or something. But it's just left over from the founding. So here it is today. If you go to New York, you can go, depending on when you go, you can actually go and see like inside and these sorts of things. Pretty cool. And the real power of the United Nations, unlike the League of Nations, is their ability to enforce. They do peacekeeping missions, they can engage in sanctions, and like here you have the sort of blue helmets, or in this case berets, right? These are actual UN soldiers that carry out peacekeeping efforts. And they're not like just, dudes with water bottles. These are like special forces soldiers from all the different countries that contribute. So they tend to be a very powerful force when they're deployed. They're often deployed to places that are having inter-regional conflicts or something like this to sort of see if they can mediate and keep groups from sort of attacking each other, right, in line with UN resolutions. So, okay, we've had some sort of quest for justice. We have this big international body that's going to try to have political solutions. But how are we going to like build the future? What are we going to build, rebuild, right? So here again, you have kids. This is maybe what's left of their school, right? So the kids are like literally rebuilding. But people thought after the war there should be some sort of new, sort of global economic model. And the Allies, in particular Britain and the United States, hoped to lead that. Obviously, Russia wants something different, right? They want a more communist model. But in 1944 at Bretton Woods, which is like in the US and New England, there's this big conference where the US and the United Kingdom basically try to lay out an economic policy for what the world will look like after the war, how the money is going to work. So they create things like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, and it's no coincidence those are always led by Europeans in the United States, to sort of dictate the central economy or sort of major global planning for massive, massive loans, like loans of billions of dollars to countries to build dams or to engage in all kinds of civic projects. And a lot of this money, a lot of this new world sort of planning in terms of economics is going to be about rebuilding the places that were destroyed during the war. So if you remember back to World War I, the Treaty of Versailles was really punitive on Germany, and a lot of people use that as an explanation for why Germany went to war again. So this time they think, well, instead of punishing Germany and giving them a big bill and keeping them repressed, let's build them up. Let's see if we can build them the way we want them instead. So tons and tons of American dollars are going to go to Europe and to Japan to reconstruct it. This is a little bit tricky because it's self-serving. So here you go. Here's part of the Marshall Plan, right? Americans just dumping a bunch of money in Europe to rebuild it. some kids getting fed, going to school, all that sort of stuff. That's great. But the way Congress set this up was all of that money had to be used to buy American stuff whenever possible. So we were giving money to Europe to rebuild, but if they wanted to buy a tractor, they had to buy an American tractor with that money. So it sort of was a 2-for-1. It sort of was in our interest to do that, but also propped up our economic interests as well. A lot less money was given directly to Japan, right? So 14 billion in aid to Europe, but only 500 million to Japan. And the US has a much more active occupation there, so we'll kind of see how that plays out. But it wasn't just the sort of Western European bloc that was doing this. Eastern Europe was getting rebuilt as well. Here are some nice Soviet kids. This might be in Poland, Ukraine, Estonia, who knows, right? The Soviet Union was also engaging in their own sort of rebuilding plans to try and make the new sort of aspects of Europe that were in their satellite sort of livable and get those economies working again. So how does this sort of rebuilding lead to the Cold War, right? Because I told you already, it basically starts right after World War II. There's this sort of fundamental misunderstanding between the new sort of superpowers in the world. The United States is clearly number one, and then you got the Soviet Union, and they just really don't see eye to eye right from the beginning. So after World War II, the United States was the undisputed hegemonic power in the world. We're number one. This was a lot of reasons. The US joined the war late. The US, other than Pearl Harbor, didn't really see any death or destruction inside of the country. And Pearl Harbor wasn't even a state, right, when that happened. Hawaii wasn't a state. So like inside of the continental US, it's like just nothing happened. So whereas Europe was pretty beat down, the US was still pretty much whole. We'd had to ration things, of course, but the economy just stepped right back up. Europe owed a lot of money to the United States. We had new markets in Japan and China. So there's a lot of reasons for this. Also, the United States had just developed the atomic bomb, which made us the most powerful sort of military state for a little bit. But number two was the Soviet Union. And then everybody else was kind of way far away for a while. So when the United Nations was founded, and you had this Security Council, right, that I already told you was those 5 countries, that's sort of the historical legacy from the Allies, there was sort of disputes immediately. So the United States didn't want China to be represented by Mao and the communists. The communists had won the Civil War in China, or were about to, and the US was worried that if China was a communist country and had a vote in the UN, and the Soviet Union was communist, had a vote in the UN, that it would be a lot more split. So on any kind of issue inside the UN, the Soviet Union could veto something that it didn't like by the US could veto something it didn't like by the Soviet Union, and it immediately sort of set up problems there. Then in 1947, Truman, who was the president of the United States, came out with the sort of Truman Doctrine, what's going to be called that. And basically, the United States government position is they would support any group around the world that was resisting communism. So the US had become so sort of anti-communist that the idea was it had to be contained wherever it was showing up, even if it was, local people that wanted it. That wasn't allowed under the US system. So the US had been sort of slowly becoming more of the world police, starting in the Caribbean and World War I and World War II. But this is a pretty big step because they're saying in any country, even if there's a local communist, sort of movement, that it's the responsibility or within the purview of the US to stop it. But the problem with this is just because you're anti-communist doesn't mean you're nice or good, right? Remember, the Nazis were anti-communist. So in fact, the US supports horrible regimes that are dictators, that are committing genocide, that are breaking the law in all kinds of ways, dealing drugs, stuff like that, internationally, as long as they oppose communism. So that's going to set up some problems coming down the line. Also, in 1948, that Marshall Plan, that's all that money to rebuild the European economy, the Soviets see that with a lot of suspicion because the US dumping all this money to rebuild Europe, they're not giving it to the Soviet Union. They're spending most of it in Western Europe in this way that's designed to sort of shore up allegiances and make people love the US and sort of turn towards the American camp. So the Soviets are very suspicious of that. So right away, there's this sort of conflict between these two superpowers. At the same time, there's a bunch of sort of global things that are happening that lead into a strange sort of Cold War, right? So it's called the Cold War because the U.S. and the Soviet Union were not officially at war. They didn't like bomb each other or something like that. However, there were lots of other little places where there were conflicts that both were involved, and you're probably familiar with like Vietnam, for example, or something like that. So in 1945, for example, you can see this sort of starting with the division of Germany. Remember, Germany they're gonna lose the war, and they get sort of divided amongst the Allies. As you can see on this map, you have West Germany and East Germany, and East Germany is gonna sort of fall within the protection or within the sort of colonization almost of the Soviet Union. Likewise, Berlin, which was the capital of Germany, is now in East Germany, and that city gets divided into a part for each ally, which is very strange. And I'm sure you're familiar with the sort of Berlin Wall, right? The Soviets build a wall down the middle of the city to wall off their section of the city. So there starts to be tension, sort of not in the US, not in the Soviet Union, but like in these other sites, right? At the same time, something weird is going to happen that hadn't really sort of happened like this before. The United States is going to occupy Japan. Theoretically, there were other occupying forces, Britain, Australia, whatever, but that's not really how it played out, really. The United States was in charge of the occupation. So you have like this photo. That's General Douglas MacArthur there on the left. And then on the right, you have Emperor Hirohito. This was a propaganda photo put out by MacArthur. He was obsessed with sort of propaganda photos. So Emperor Hirohito here is like dressed really, really formally. He's short. He's looks like totally stiff and rigid. But MacArthur is tall. He's dressed less formally. He's relaxed. It's clear sort of he's in charge. Like Hirohito almost looks like his butler or something, right? So during the American occupation of Japan, the idea was the United States would sort of rebuild it and help, right? We would be envoys of peace, right? The US Army. We would sort of steer Japan away from this ugly period it had been in and help sort of rebuild it, ensure they didn't militarize again, and sort of lead East Asia into a more peaceful future. But some people see a sort of different picture. On the ground, a lot of American soldiers behaved quite badly in Japan. There was lots of drinking, lots of prostitutes, lots of Japanese folks didn't have any money, didn't have any resources, so they were very easily exploited by American dollars and American soldiers. And the occupation of Japan was a pretty weird period. It's successful in the end, and that Japan does become a good democratic, sort of liberal democratic state. The economy does great, in large part because of the American wars in Korea and Vietnam. But so it is successful, but it's not like the occupation was just like benevolent and things like this, right? There's a lot more complexity to it. At the same time, you see things like a war in Greece and Turkey against communism. So remember, the US would support any government or any rebels or any forces that oppose communism. So in Greece and Turkey, there were sort of indigenous communist movements. Sometimes they got support from Russia, sometimes not. And the US funded the people that fought them. However, the people that fought those communists were often pretty far to the right. Some of them supported fascism. Some of them engaged in all kinds of awful behaviors that we had a problem with when the Japanese or the Nazis did it, but we were kind of okay as long as it was being used against communists, right? By the end of the 1940s, you start to see things like this. This is an absolutely crazy situation. The Berlin airlift, the United States, and the other, Britain and France, were very concerned about what was going on in Berlin. Right, it was in Eastern Germany, and there was this section that was supposed to be free, but it was within sort of Soviet territory. It was like a little bubble. So the U.S. would send all day long, like planes to fly over Eastern Germany. These were like former bomber planes that would drop stuff and then fly back. And they would drop like crates filled with bananas and oatmeal and stuff like this to sort of try to support West Berlin. um, but what happens to a crate filled with bananas when you drop it out of a plane? Maybe it doesn't go so well, right? So this project was really funky. It was very symbolic, like the U.S. was feeding and helping the people of West Berlin, and it was sort of a thumb in the eye to the Soviet Union. But how successful was it? It's pretty sort of unclear. Um, and all of these sorts of things are leading to the development of what comes to be called the Iron Curtain across Europe, right? So people start to see like Britain and France and Belgium and West Germany and stuff as being in the free world, and then East Germany and over to the Soviet Union as being in these sort of communist satellites or in the sort of Soviet world. And there's a really big distinction, particularly in the US perspective, right? Um, at the same time, the United States is massively expanding around the globe in terms of its military and military power, not just in Japan. So we'll kind of get back to that in a second. So 1949 is a huge year for the Cold War. This is when everything happening in the 40s and after the war kind of hits the fan. So in 1949, NATO is founded. That's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Basically, the United States, Britain, Canada, France, all the Scandinavian countries sign into an agreement that if they're attacked by the Soviet Union, they'll all defend each other. And NATO forces, the sort of military forces that come out of this, are part of the treaty. Each country will donate a certain percentage of their GDP and a certain number of soldiers to have a force kind of ready to go to attack the Soviet Union should need be. Pretty aggressive, right? East and West Germany are fully formed by 1949. The communists take over in China. So here you have Mao Zedong proclaiming the founding of the Chinese state. The Communist Party in China had been around since the 1920s, but in 1949, they sort of officially win. Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the nationalists, is going to leave China proper. He's going to end up in Taiwan. And the communists are going to declare that the new sort of Chinese state is run by the CCP. And this is really problematic because remember, China had been an American ally during World War II. So by 1949, they're definitely not an ally anymore. And Americans are going to see this as like a loss to communism, right, which is what they were trying to prevent. Also in 1949, the Soviet Union detonates their own atomic bomb. And this causes a sort of panic that the communists are now as strong as the United States. The Korean Peninsula is about to go to war, right? The Korean War is going to start pretty quickly afterwards. And you get this sort of general Red Scare in the United States. There had been one after World War I as well. But so here's a nice propaganda poster. Is this tomorrow America under communism? So what happens if communism comes to America? It'll be all rioting and looting and raping and like burning things, which is a really weird idea because communism is an economic model. So how would it lead to this? Well, I'm not sure. But people were really freaked out about it. And you can see this in all kinds of ways. This was from a still from a movie. sort of preview. There's this movie that comes out around these times. There's lots of movies that comes out around these times about like women that are secretly spies for the communists and are engaging in like murder and all these sorts of things. So like you might think this woman next door is like some, sweet innocent housewife, but really she's a commie spy, right? So it really got kind of over the top. Um, and you can see this play out in sort of the internal political structure of the United States, leading to what might be called McCarthyism. So here you have Joseph McCarthy, right? He was a member of Congress. And during this sort of second Red Scare, he really is going to lead this. He basically says that there's communists everywhere. He's a conspiracy theorist. Today he'd be like totally hip to QAnon, I'm sure, and all that sort of stuff. But he believes that you have to look out everywhere. You have to root out all of these like secret people that are in the government that are communists or communist sympathizers that are trying to like destroy America. So this goes some weird places. In 1947, for example, by act of Congress, all government employees can be screened for loyalty. Well, loyalty is a really tricky word. What does it actually mean? Loyalty to what? To the United States? Okay, that's cool. Loyalty to a particular type of government in the United States? I don't know. That's more interesting. Um, so how do you choose? For example, to get this job, I had to sign a piece of paper that said I was loyal to the state of Georgia. Uh, what does that even mean, right? Like, does that mean like I don't like Hawaii anymore, or like, I grew up in, I lived in Washington when I was a kid, and then I went to school in Oregon and Hawaii. Do I like those states more than Georgia or something? I don't know. Like if I go like vacation in Florida, am I like not being loyal to Georgia or something? It's a very strange idea. So there's all kinds of different ways you might describe this, and anything you do in the future might be held against you, right? And they say, oh, I thought you were loyal. You signed this piece of paper that said you were loyal to the US government, but I saw you at this protest, so now we can fire you or arrest you or whatever, right? So this is really tricky. And there just hadn't really been language like this in the US yet. McCarthy is going to open the House Un-American Activities Committee, where, okay, yeah, so here's like a propaganda poster. Americans don't patronize Reds, right? Yeah, they're in TV, they're in advertising, right? So here's the House Un-American Activities Committee. Basically, you get a subpoena, you get dragged before Congress. Maybe you're a Hollywood star, maybe you're a journalist, maybe you're a writer or a professor or a labor union leader, or, in some way or another, you're kind of a prominent person, and you catch the eye of someone sort of drifting towards the far right, and they think you're a communist or they think you're a communist sympathizer. So they bring you before Congress and they make you testify. So thousands of people were dragged before Congress, and this is what it looks like. Look at all the lights on you, all the public, all the press, these congressmen like in your face, and they turn to you and they say, "Hey, Jim, Smith, is it true that you're homosexual?" And there's like lights and cameras, and you're like, what? Because if you're homosexual, maybe you're not loyal to the government. The idea was it would be easy to exploit you. It would be easy for communists to exploit you. Or did you give money to the Youth for, Democratic Free Speech in California? And you'd be like, what did I don't know. Did you sign this piece of paper that said you were loyal to this and this, but then we saw that in this newspaper interview you said that maybe America could change. So like all this weird stuff would be dragged up and sort of used against you to try to convince you to testify against others. So after being sort of browbeaten for a few hours about things you've done, the congressman would sort of shift and say, oh, okay, we believe you. Maybe you're not a horrible person. Maybe you're okay. Maybe you are a good American. But surely you know people who aren't. Why don't you just give us the names of some communists or homosexuals or communist sympathizers or people that we ought to look into? And if you didn't want to do that, you were proving that you weren't a good American, right? So they kind of have you both ways. Either you're a good American and you're snitching on people that's like just made up situation, or you're a bad American because you won't engage in this sort of gross thing they were doing. Um, so along the same lines, during this time, the FBI develops, led by J. Edgar Hoover. And the idea the early FBI had in particular was keeping files on Americans, prominent Americans, even including the president and other people, that could be sort of used against them in the future or used to monitor them. Things like fingerprinting and photo identification and all kinds of stuff like this was being used more and more by the government to track people, to pay attention to them, to monitor them. So this is really, in many ways, when the American government starts to get into this sort of business, sort of monitoring its own citizens in this way, looking for sort of divergence. At the same time, there's lots of other things kind of creeping people out. One of the sort of early characteristics of the Cold War is coming to terms with atomic bombs and atomic weaponry. So remember we saw that the US dropped the atomic bombs, 2 of them on Japan, on the 6th and the 9th of August in 1945, kind of ending the Pacific War in a way. Tons of people died, mostly civilians, and we talked about the number of this was incredibly high, right? So twice as many Japanese civilians died from just those 2 bombs as all of the American soldiers in the Pacific. So people started to get a sense of what that meant and think maybe this was disproportionate. Um, in war, is there a limit to the number of people you should kill, or the number of people you should kill all at once, or the number of people you should kill to stop the war, or to save, 100 of your own people? Is it okay to kill 10,000 of the other side? So these sorts of questions were sort of circulating, and people began to realize there was a lot more to the bombs than what they had thought. Pictures like this start circulating around the world, right, showing just the massive level of destruction that came from the bombs, but also pictures like this. So afterwards, there's a lot of radiation and other problems that come. The bombs cause birth defects. They very badly burnt people but didn't kill them. People lost their hair. People lost all kinds of sort of standard bodily functions that took a long time to come back. People were maimed and mutilated in all kinds of disturbing ways. And there was a sort of lingering sickness that came from radiation that slowly went away, but over the next couple decades, people were still suffering from the effects of radiation poisoning and dying from it. Massive increase in the cases of cancer and all that sort of stuff. So people began to ask, should the bombs have been dropped? Should we have sort of unleashed this power into the world? And that went in some very strange directions. So this debates about the atomic bomb was not just sort of limited to foreign policy and should we use them in the war and stuff like that. There was more and more bomb testing, and there started to be this fear of radiation, and this really started to develop the genre of science fiction in a new way. So there had been science fiction before, of course, like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and all that sort of stuff. But the atom kind of added a new dimension to it. So here you go, here's like a nice 25-cent pamphlet. The atom bomb, here is the full story of atomic power, past, present, and future. Is it a blessing or will it smash humanity? Okay, right? But there's also things like this. Atomic bombing, how to protect yourself. Hey man, if you live in that city, it doesn't matter, right? If a modern atomic bomb goes off in Atlanta and you're in Atlanta, that's it, it just doesn't matter. And so people started to, there was kind of a collective fear of these things, but also a realization of how massively destructive. So you tried to sort of assuage that fear. You had kids like duck and cover under their desks in school, but that wouldn't really have done anything. Okay, so here you have science fiction, The Man Who Sold the Earth, Death and the Dictator. Here's like some bird man running away with a woman from some alien space station or something. Okay, this is really weird, right? This is like mutations and all this sort of stuff. If you're like hip to the X-Men, right? They were supposed to have been it was the mutation, right, in the genes was from atomic energy. People started talking this way, these sorts of ideas that hadn't really been around yet. Amazing adventures. So here you have this like weird Martian manning some kind of love robot, invasion of the love robots, right? People started to see UFOs. People started to think about aliens coming. So here's the day the Earth stood still, right? The original movie, because there was this new idea of like hyper technology, all of these new scientific sounding words, this realization that the United States had this like crazy powerful weapon that could do this kind of massive damage, world-changing damage. And by 1949, the Soviets have their own bomb. So there became this idea that like they might launch bombs at each other and the world would just be destroyed. By 1950, for the first time in human history, people had the ability to just destroy the entire species. And this continues today. There's thousands of atomic bombs. If they were launched for some reason, that's it. Humanity would end, more or less. Humanity could be wiped out. Particularly in like the 70s and 80s, there were so many atomic bombs that it would have been easy to just destroy all human life. And this was really the first time this could be done. If you're talking about like swords and arrows, you simply can't kill everybody. But with atomic weapons, you can. And this threat hasn't gone away, right? We have bigger bombs than ever, in fact. So this added a whole sort of new sort of way of thinking of sort of space, and it really lends itself to science fiction in a certain sense. At the same time, something weird is happening in terms of culture around the world. So, for example, getting excited about science fiction or being afraid of the bomb or these sorts of things, you might call that like Cold War culture. At the same time, there was sort of a cultural Cold War going on. So in the United States, for example, there were two new government agencies, the CIA and the USIA. So the CIA, you probably know, the USIA was the United States Information Agency. They were the official propaganda agency of the United States. They disbanded after the Cold War ended, although who knows, we'll see. And the idea was that there's a war for like the hearts and minds of people around the world, and they're either going to go commie or they're going to, you know, come towards America. And so what both the CIA and the USIA were trying to do was like convince people around the world to love the United States and get on board with America, or to sort of pull them away from Soviet ideas. And this gets really funky. So if you look at this piece of art, you remember we talked a little bit about the 20s, like abstract art and stuff. It's continued, this sort of modernist art. Here's a painting, right, by Pollock, Jackson Pollock. And what's it of? Well, it's not really of anything, right? It's abstract. Abstract art, as it turns out, became popular in large part because the CIA funded massive, massive amounts of it. And this sounds really weird because you're like, no, you know, art's popular for all kinds of reasons, people like it or whatever. But ultimately, it's what gets bought and what gets put up in hotel rooms and shopping malls and what you see on TV and all these sorts of things. So why would the CIA be sponsoring abstract art or something? This is really weird, right? Well, the idea was it runs in opposition to sort of Soviet art. So Soviet art at the time was like realistic depictions of people coming together and working, and like you've probably seen these posters where they're all like charging towards something or holding up little red books, like in the case of China or something. But this message was designed to like unify the people and stuff. Well, with abstract art, you can't do that, right? There is no message to unify the people. You know, it's individualistic. Everybody gets what they put into it, right? Or everybody has their own meaning. So this was like a sort of opposite to that. Also, the U.S. did things like sponsor plays and jazz and all kinds of American cultural products that travel around the world. So Porgy and Bess was a play, musical that. So here it's Cab Calloway, right, is the singer. But basically, this goes around the world. Jazz, do I have a good picture? Yeah, okay, here you go. Um, if you don't know this guy, right, Satchmo here, Louis Armstrong. Here he is in Egypt, like playing the trumpet. Why would America send jazz musicians around the world? This is very odd, right? Well, jazz music is improvised, it's collaborative, but it doesn't have like formal rules. Music coming out of the Soviet Union was supposed to have like really formalized rules, and was like prayed type music or something. Also, jazz famously was made by African Americans, so part of the idea here was to show the world filled with all of these black and brown folks that the US kind of wanted to bring to their side, that America actually wasn't um, horribly racist, and that we did appreciate our African American brethren as well, even though we still had, segregation and all. So it's really funky. Um, and that plays back into the United States as well. So this is from uh, The King and I, right? This musical movie that was made for American audiences, and it's based on like a British book, and it's about this woman who goes to Thailand, and she sort of slowly falls in love with the king. She's supposed to be like a governess to the children, and she teaches them about the world, right? And there's a song like "Getting to Know You," getting to know all about you, right? About they're like looking at a map, and um, so for American audiences, this is really weird. First of all, this guy is not Thai, the Yul Brynner, right? And Thais aren't bald. They don't shave their head like that or anything. So this was really strange. And well, what is it about? Well, the U.S. didn't know anything about Southeast Asia. Americans didn't know anything about most of Latin America or India or Africa. And so there was this sort of impulse to like know about these other parts of the world, because we were sort of trying to court these parts of the world to like the US, right? First you got to love them, then they love you, kind of thing. But it's also kind of represents the time, right? So even though this was supposed to be a British person originally, she's also white, right? She's the only white character. So you have this uh, white lady who's like teaching these Thais about the modern world and like how to read maps and all this sort of stuff. And so Americans were like, "Oh, this is a great movie. It's like white folks teaching these brown folks how to do things, right?" So it kind of goes both ways. And this ties into what we might call like Cold War civil rights. So if you don't know this guy here, look it up. Jackie Robinson, right? Um, One of the first black baseball players to kind of make it big and actually make it into the major leagues, not be relegated to some sort of other division because he was black. So during World War II, there were some civil rights movements that really kind of blossomed after the war. And this is because during the war, a big part of American propaganda was about how the Nazis were racist. And especially after the war, when Americans start to learn more about the Holocaust and the like extreme sort of racial anger of the Nazis and stuff, their compulsion towards genocide, it becomes a little bit harder to have those same impulses in the United States. Remember, lynching was still incredibly common. People were openly racist. The state governments were openly racist. Segregation, right? We have the two different water fountains and stuff. It was like very much in your face and on purpose. It wasn't like now when you think of racism, you probably have some vision of like old, white guys or something, but that's not it. It was all of, you know, popular society. So this was a moral problem. If racism was supposed to be what the Nazis were about, why were we still doing it? So um, the civil rights movement is going to kind of push on that. At the same time, a lot of African American athletes, actors, musicians are getting popular. And if you like, a black actor or a black singer or something, but you're like a white person who feels uncomfortable around black people, maybe that's kind of a weird problem, right? And so maybe By engaging with Black culture, you might kind of undo some of that damage in your head. And there were other things tying this stuff together too, right? So like here you have some guys with signs, all men are created equal, love thy neighbor. Okay, that's Thomas Jefferson, that's Jesus, right? So big names. And then racial bias here helps communism everywhere. So if communism is evil, racism has to be evil too, right? Was sort of the argument a lot of people were making. And there was a lot of people in the FBI, CIA, the State Department, the military that were working overseas, that were fighting against communism, that were fighting against the Soviet Union, that were trying to get other countries in sub-Saharan Africa or India or Southeast Asia to love the United States, but they would be at their foreign mission, and someone would say, hey, yeah, this is great and all, but isn't the US really racist? Like, what did they just do to that person at the sit-in or whatever? And so diplomats and politicians were having a really hard time explaining these things. You know, how do you get people in Nigeria to love the United States when all they have to do is read a newspaper, and see what's happening in the American South in the 50s? So the State Department was warning Washington, like, we got to do something about this because it's looking really bad for us. It was kind of more of an idea at the time than a practice, but it is sort of a big push for civil rights that comes from the Cold War as well. Here you go. Here's some of the pushback. So race mixing is communism, right? Race mixing is communism. Stop the race mixing. So here you have people that are on the opposite side arguing to keep segregation, to keep open racism. By the way, where did all these people go? If you think these people disappeared, they didn't, right? It's not like they died immediately after taking this photo. They had kids, they raised those kids. What were the chances those kids had similar values? Right? These people became police officers, judges, teachers, lawyers, doctors, right? So this is not that long ago, right? These are someone's grandparents, right? So this was really an interesting idea. There's a lot of pushback on this as well. Prison is better than the army, Jim Crow service, right? We demand equal stuff. So theoretically, the army had been integrated, right, after World War II. But in reality, it wasn't integrated until the Korean War, right? So now we can just lay out kind of quickly the new shape the world starting to take between 1945 and 1950. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about this because we're going to do decolonization next time and we'll get a lot more of this sort of stuff. So you got these two superpowers, right? The US and the USSR, and all the old empires couldn't really compete anymore. These superpowers saw each other as complete opposites and eventually as evil. Just like Americans were super anti-communist and saw the Russians as evil, in Russia the propaganda was working the exact same way, right? And they just kind of saw each other from the same perspective. Most Russians thought the US was trying to sort of encircle the Soviet Union, was trying to cut them off from the rest of the world, and that was true. Most Americans thought that communism was trying to expand and would eventually try to come to America or something, and maybe that was true too. So they saw each other in these sort of polar opposite terms, and the rest of the world was seen as sort of pawns between them, or places to be won, or places to be defended, or something like this. So during the 1950s in particular, both the Soviet Union and the United States actively engage in sometimes secret, sometimes open missions to control the politics and economies and militaries of foreign countries. Both the US and the Soviet Union overthrow totally legitimate democratic governments. This is why in Guatemala, for example, there's still a lot of feelings against the US, right? A brand new democratic government came into Guatemala. The US didn't like it, so we overthrew that government and just kind of left the country to suffer. So lots of things like this happened. This happened in all kinds of various places. Cuba, right? The Russians supported them, stuff like that. So by the mid-1950s, though, the US clearly had the sort of military advantage. and had expanded all over the world. So 450 military bases in at least 35 countries by the 1950s. Now the US has thousands of military bases around the world, or shared bases in more than 100 countries easily. In fact, they don't even list, it's not even public knowledge where all of the US bases are in all the other countries. This was found out after 2001 anyway. So you have these two major powers at the top, the Soviet Union and the United States, kind of tugging back and forth at each other. All of the old empires, Britain, France, the oldest empires like Spain, right, the oldest European empires, they've totally fallen into decline. And the people who were in the empire are now sort of starting to push for independence. And we saw this growing in the 20s and 30s. After World War II, it's crystal clear that the empires of the sort of first half of the 20th century can't hang around anymore. So this is really tricky, though, because the US wanted Europe to keep its colonies because they wanted to regrow Europe, right? They wanted to rebuild France and Britain and Belgium and stuff. They wanted those to become strong, liberal, democratic countries to resist communism. But in order to do that, they would have to squeeze their colonies to get money and people, resources, food, all that sort of stuff. So the US was pro-colonization, which is really problematic because in the colonies, in India, in Vietnam, all over West Africa, people saw the US as the sort of first anti-colonial power, right? They rebelled against Britain. The Constitution, freedom, democracy, liberty, and justice. A lot of countries modeled their constitutions on the US, tried to get independence, and they asked the US for help even, and the US said no, because they wanted France to keep colonizing Vietnam, right, so that France could rebuild. So this set up a lot of sort of disconnections. And communism gained a lot of traction in these early decolonizing nations because these people were repressed, they were often poor, they were exploited by imperialist powers, and communism really had a good answer to that. So pretty quickly you see places like India and Pakistan breaking away and agitating for independence. In the early 50s, you have the Korean War. Then you're gonna have like the Indo-Chinese War in Vietnam, right? So there you go, some pictures of that. Here you go, getting Ho Chi Minh. And we'll talk a lot more about these in the next one where we talk more sort of formally about decolonization. This is just to kind of get you a sense of what's going on. Also, in places like the Arab world, as largely stated, although it's a lot more complex, there's these new states that form after World War II. Remember, there was that mandate system left over from World War I that hadn't worked very well. But a lot of the Arab states had a pretty easy time getting independence after World War II. So you look at these dates like Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, they all are sort of getting independence right after World War II. Egypt before, Iraq before, Turkey before, Saudi Arabia before, right? Sudan's going to take a little while. So unlike other places in Africa or South Asia, these places get a sort of formal countries much quicker just when the mandate system falls apart. But they remain heavily influenced by Europe in particular, and the United States to a lesser degree. And there's this idea that all of these different places, from this new state of Israel to Lebanon to Saudi Arabia, will somehow like come together and they'll be like Arab states and they'll agree. But so here's a picture of some of the leaders from these different states, like all next to each other. So you'll notice like they're totally different race and ethnic groups. They speak different languages, they have different histories. There was this sort of fantasy that like somehow they would all like get along and that basically they were all kind of the same. But that was really difficult. There was no sort of sense of unity in the same way you might find like Pan-African ideas that had been circulating earlier. There just was no Pan-Arab sort of vibe that everybody could agree on, particularly once Israel becomes a state. Speaking of which, how'd that happen? This is interesting. So it was originally Palestine, which was sort of the mandate sort of left over. It had been a mandate property of the British. After 45, for very obvious reasons, lots of Jewish folks wanted to get the hell out of Europe, and there had been a movement already known as Zionism in the Jewish community to sort of create a nation state for Jewish folks. So this seemed like a good opportunity. The British basically can't figure out what's going on, and they give up. So in 1947, the British turn over Palestine to the newly formed United Nations. And the United Nations comes up with a plan, which is going to be kind of popular around this time for a little bit, where they partition the state into two different pieces, one Jewish and one Arab. So if you look at the map here, this was Palestine, was the mandate. The yellow area in the middle is deemed an Arab state, and the orange area will become the new Jewish state. But this is really problematic. First of all, it goes over at the piece of another state, right, Syria up there. But also those two orange pieces don't touch. So the new Jewish state is like divided in half. That's pretty problematic. Also, all of these new Jewish folks that are coming in from Europe might not necessarily get along with the folks that are there already, who tend to be Muslim. At first, this wasn't such a problem, and historically this hadn't been such a problem, but after the war, there was a real desire for Jewish folks to have their own state, and they were sort of promised this by Europeans. On the other hand, the Palestinians that were there were promised independence from the British. It was a real mess. So pretty much immediately afterwards, there's a civil war that happens there. If you can even really describe it that way, it's kind of tricky. And out of that civil war in 1948, there's a new Israeli state. Do I have a picture? Oh yeah, okay, here you go. So you get that state of Israel that's orange in there. That's what happens in 1948. Now, as you can see, there's a bunch of other stuff that's going to happen in the 60s and 70s that sort of expands and contracts these sorts of states. So that West Bank area, right? People often think the West Bank, for some reason, is like the west side of Israel, but remember, it's the west side of the River Jordan, which is like in. Anyway, so in the 70s, for example, so in 1967, there's a war, the so-called 6 Days War, where Israel is going to take over a big chunk of land around it, and that land is slowly returned to Egypt and Syria and other places. But there's going to be a lot of conflict in this region, as you're probably aware, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about decolonization next time. So the Cold War was begun just immediately in the wake of World War II, and the world starts to shift out in these two pieces. Are you communist? Are you a liberal democracy? Are you West or East? Are you good or bad, right? All these sorts of things. Along very clearly cut lines, even though those lines are not really clearly cut. They're only clearly cut in people's imaginations. And this is going to lead towards issues with decolonization for sure. So next time, that's what we're going to talk about. Get on that reading. Let me know if you have any questions. See you then.